Our last speakers of the day are two people working together on a talk, Sandra Jacobson and Patricia Kramer. Sandy is a wildlife biologist for the USDA Forest Service's Pacific Southwest Research Station, where she specializes in transportation ecology and provides technical expertise and training nationally. Sandra has worked for the Forest Service since 1980, primarily in the National Forest System in California and Idaho. She is an invited charter member of the National Academy's Transportation Research Board Committee on Ecology and Transportation. Sandra served on the expert panel for congressionally mandated report on animal vehicle collisions, the Western Governors Association Transportation Task Force for their initiative on wildlife movement and crucial habitat, the UC Davis Road Ecology Center's Scientific Advisory Committee, and is a steering committee member for the International Conference on Ecology and Transportation. Sandra is presenting today with Patricia Kramer. Patty is a research assistant professor at Utah State University. She is currently researching wildlife and roads across Utah, along US 93 in Montana, and across Washington State. Dr. Kramer was co-author with John Bissonnette on the National Academy's research project, Evaluation of the Use and Effectiveness of Wildlife Crossings. This 4-year study helped to understand the state of the practice and science of mitigating roads for wildlife in North America. This month, she received the Denver Zoo's Conservation Award for 2010.
Thank you for inviting us here, or at least allowing us to be here. Patty and I decided that restoring the West has a lot to do with how animals use the habitat, and that's a really important thing because in terms of their movement, if all the good work that you guys are doing to restore habitat means that animals cannot get to that habitat, then they're not going to be able to take advantage of it. So highways are one of the features on the landscape that make it very difficult for animals to effectively use all the things that they have access to, or all the things that they should have access to, and did in the past. Okay, next technological question is how this works. Okay, so we're going to split our talk into 3 parts, and Patty and I are going to share these parts. The first part will be impacts and how that affects, in particular, the topic of this conference, and that is how highways affect the way that animals can use their habitat. And then we'll talk a little bit about some mitigation measures that have been useful. And finally, we'll just really briefly touch on the very, very complex topic of transportation planning. So the first one is impacts. Okay, most of you probably don't think too much about this particular agent of impacts because you take it for granted. I mean, does anybody not have a car in here? You know, almost every American has at least one car and probably several. This particular car is my car, and I have only hit one deer with it. But lots of other things. But this agent is really unique among other agents that affect wildlife, and it does all these things. I'm not going to read all of them, but when you look at this list, it's very, very different than all of the agents that animals have evolved to avoid the effects of. So we have to kind of give them a leg up in mitigating. Okay, so the 2 greatest impacts that highways have is mortality and avoidance. Avoidance meaning that they can't make it across the highway because they avoid the highway. There's too much noise, too much smell, too many people that are just there. There's all kinds of things that they do not like. So they don't even necessarily try to cross. Now we see this part, the proportion of animals killed, and that is what we're not going to talk about today because that's an obvious effect. It does have an impact clearly on some populations, but because we're talking more about habitat, we're not going to really talk about that today. Okay, so one of the things that helps to cause this effect of avoidance is that a lot of highways, particularly in the western states, have a very large cut and fill material balance. And this is a highway in Arizona, and this isn't even as steep a topography as some have. But look at the extent of these cuts, and then usually their engineers try to do what's called material balance, so that there's an equivalent amount of fill somewhere else. If they're doing their job right, then those two balance out. That means someplace else there's another place just like this on the other side, on the downhill side. So when you look at this expanse, it is actually a considerable expanse, because not only are we looking at crossing the highway, which in this case is 4 lanes plus a center median for literally miles. You can't see that in here, but take my word for it, it is. But you also have the expanse of a completely devegetated area that is in this clear zone. The clear zone plus the cut and fill. So when you're looking at highways as you're driving along, you're probably not thinking about them in terms of what the loss of habitat is or what that avoidance effect is, because you're really pretty used to seeing those. We drive on highways all the time. But next time you drive, especially in a mountainous area, take a look at the amount of habitat that's gone from cuts and fills. Sometimes you have a filter effect too, because these highways tend to filter animals differently. Some animals can get across not only because they don't avoid highways as much, they're not as sensitive, but others are very sensitive. And this is a case with wolves and elk, where elk really have, a really celebrated example is in the township of Banff, where in Canada, where the elk have figured out that they can just go through town and the wolves stay on the other side of town. So it's a safe filtering effect, and highways do that with all sorts of different animal pairs. That can really affect predator-prey relationships. So some of these other impacts from highways are these. I will go over some of them. Songbirds, surprisingly enough, need to hear songs in order to maintain their territories. And there's a lot of good research that indicates that highways have a greatly reduced habitat effect because of the influence of noise for a long ways out. And it varies depending on what species it is. So woodland birds have a different effect than do grassland birds. And surprisingly, a species that maybe for those of you who work in forested environments, you may not think of a bird such as a woodland grouse that is affected by highways. But how many of you have seen grouse killed on a highway, roadkill? Not very many. And the reason is because studies have shown that they actually are avoiders. That is, they do not approach highways nearly as much as what they should. That means there's a big band of habitat that they are not using. There are several other species, of course, that are like that as well. And the big thing too is habitat loss. You can have some really serious habitat loss, and again, we kind of are used to seeing highways, so we're not noticing this. But when you look at a newly constructed highway, it starts to kind of make sense. This is on the Tonto National Forest in Arizona, and here, this particular bridge is what this is going to look like. So when you're driving over that bridge, you're saying, oh wow, this is really nice. This road is 4-lane, it's separated. What a great job these guys did. However, and they did, but they had to really break a lot of eggs to do it. And that is worse than any clear cut you'll ever find. So there's when we think about the things that cause habitat loss, highways are a substantial loss there. Okay, I'm going to run through these really quickly because they're showing kind of the range of effects of different species from highways. This is Redwood National Park, Prairie Creek Redwood State Park. This is a highway that was put in before the concept of mitigating for wildlife movement or even wildlife habitat was not really considered much. They did actually work very hard on this project for the redwoods themselves, but they weren't thinking so much about the wildlife that were living there. And this is on the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I think this is showing a very wide swath. To my knowledge, there is no mitigation for this project. This is, I believe, Corridor H, which is a very, very large project. And if it wasn't for the size of the bridges there, it'd cause a lot more damage. The Wayne National Forest in Ohio was the largest intact bunch of habitat for cerulean warblers, which is an interior nesting species. And then the Nelsonville Bypass project came along. And this was just taken about 2 months ago, and they're moving a lot of dirt here. This is in Oregon, in the Ponderosa Pine area, what they call the Black Rock Pine stuff, lots of lava and so forth. And again, you're breaking a lot of eggs to make this omelet. In this case, we did, however, get some mitigation. We've got 2 wildlife crossings on this project. It was the first ones in Oregon of any substantial nature. And so even though this looks really bad, it will at least provide some movement. Again, on the Tonto National Forest, we have this project that affected desert tortoise. This project, fortunately, did actually put in a number of bridges, but even putting in bridges, it's not totally possible to avoid the habitat loss that occurs from just moving dirt around. Ninepipe National Wildlife Refuge, and this is a project that has tried to consider ways in which we could mitigate for the mortality of turtles as they're crossing the road, as well as for their movement. And that brings a very brief end to the impact section.
Oh, thank you. All right, thank you, Sandy. I'm going to run through some of the ways you can mitigate all those terrible scars on the landscape. I'm one of the queens. Sandy and I are the queens of wildlife crossings in the United States. So if you have questions, let us know. All right. I just wanted to quickly thank all the different agencies that help support my research. Some of you folks are here. Thank you so much. I can't do it without you. I'm going to talk about wildlife crossings. These are white-tailed deer crossing in Montana from the study I do. The most effective mitigation solution for wildlife and roads is wildlife crossings with fencing. The medieval part of it, the fencing. There are underpasses where wildlife pass under the roadway, and overpasses where they go over, of course. The types of wildlife underpasses are culverts. On the bottom left there's a culvert you could drive a herd of elephants through. That's in Utah, so I'm going to touch on that later. That's a wildcat crossing on I-15. If you're going south of here, you'll go over it. On the right is a box culvert that Sandy actually helped make come about in Idaho. And then there's culverts just as tiny as they can be, but they also can be retrofit with shells on them for wildlife. Here's a culvert. If you leave here and go over the mountains to Brigham City and onto I-15 south, you'll go over it. It's just outside of town on milepost 14. The elk refuse to go through it, but the moose do and the mule deer do. And here's some mule deer going through it. This culvert's right by that Ruby pipeline scar that you see on the landscape as you go south, right by all the construction. Lots of mule deer use. Underpasses, you can also have bridges. We would love you to push for a bridge if you work with the DOT. Bridges are way better for most wildlife than culverts are. They're more expensive, but they work much better for an array of species, including particularly the prey species. So on the left is an underpass in Montana of a bridge, and on the right is something in California. This is another bridge in Montana that I've got cameras on, and even though that bridge is really short, we've got quite a few white-tailed deer going through it, and they just adapted to it very nicely this past year. This photo I just love. This should be my title slide. Just a million words there, not just 1,000. You know, here's a bridge on I-90 over the Clay Island River. It was not made for wildlife, but they are adapting to it. And even with the roar of 60,000 vehicles per day and Domino's pizza trucks going through, deer and and elk actually go through this. So bridges that are there for wildlife, and then bridges that are just happen to be there that can work for wildlife. There's a new approach. I wanted to mention this, and Bruce Bonebrake is very instrumental in getting this established. This is a new crossing. Bruce works for the Division of Wildlife here in Utah. They have this new approach. If you look on the lower right, these are arches that are plated together to form somewhat of a culvert, but it's so much more big and wide than the usual culvert. I'm calling it an arch. And this is going on right now as we speak on I-70. Overpasses. This used to be the only picture I could show of overpasses, and this and one more, because Banff really is the king, queen of overpasses. This is 150 feet wide. They're in Banff National Park. They have 2 and 2 more going in. So they did a great job, but we started it here in Utah. Last summer, a bunch of overpasses went in on US 93, which goes from Arizona all the way up to Alberta. This overpass is just north of Missoula. It's $1.8 million, so over 2 lanes of road. They definitely have had bear, moose, and deer going over it. This is the first time I've shown this slide. I just got it from Lori Bellis, Nevada DOT. Nevada used to have nothing, and then last year they got on the handle and got this overpass as well in 93. Again, 1.8 million, and they put fencing up and corresponding wildlife underpasses. The deer were using it within days of it, and look how barren that is, but yet the mule deer are willing to go over it. So overpasses work really wonderfully for wildlife. This is the first overpass in North America. It was an I-15 here in Utah, and I've got a camera on there, and we've got hundreds of mule deer passing it every year. They use it for migration. And this baby just came through a couple of weeks ago, and we made sure that the hunt is over for elk, so you can't sit out there and wait for these guys. I'm getting tired of seeing pictures of hunters preying on critters trying to get across the highway. You can also retrofit. This is just I'm kind of gearing the talk for those of you that work with agencies and DOTs. You can help get existing bridges more friendly for wildlife on the left there, I-80 and here in Utah, or just put flanging and fencing to existing corridors to get smaller critters to go to them. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about this research project that Darren introduced me with. Basically, what we've got over 700 terrestrial wildlife crossings in the United States and Canada. That's after talking to about 400 people, and tens of thousands of aquatic. So we have a lot out there. This is gives you an idea where your state is in the ranking. This is as of 2007, although I did update Nevada because I didn't want that big fat 0 that they had before last year. The ones in blue are the states that are very good at aquatic crossings. The states in green are the ones that are doing a great job with terrestrial crossings. There's an exponential increase in crossings in every decade. That's why if you haven't heard about them too much, it's because they're really up and coming, and there's over 500 terrestrial ones planned from 2006 to 2015. I just want to touch on the fact that we should be researching mitigation. Pre-construction monitoring is essential. Yes, it's very, very rare. There's less than 5 studies in the United States with that. And post-construction, if you can get that, at least get that. We use remote trail cameras, and we put them in utility boxes so that vandals don't steal them or have a really hard time stealing them. When I looked at priorities, I talked to people across the United States and Canada. The number 1 research priority is scientifically support what works and what needs improvement. Number 1, do not let anybody convince you that elk in the United States will go through culverts. Very, very rare. One place in Wyoming, a couple other places, but they do not like it. This female was looking at her baby at the other end and would not go through. Here's some monitoring we're doing in I-90 and a wildlife culvert in Washington. So we have carnivore use, and we even have animals using things that were never designed for wildlife. I didn't know that the deer would go through this, but it's great to see that they're using existing culverts. This is a retrofit story. This story is meant to illustrate that you never give up. You do not walk away, clap your hands together and say, we did it. This is I-80 between Park City and Salt Lake City. I was talking about retrofits earlier. DOT agreed to stop doing the 2-to-1 slopes like they have here. Over here, abbreviate them, put a natural wildlife path. Got stimulus funding at 3 miles of fencing, but did not get wildlife guards or cattle guards. So they said, okay, here's what we'll try. We'll paint white lines on the road to all the entrance and exit ramps, and maybe the wildlife will think they're cattle guards and won't go over them. So did it work? No, it didn't. So I have the moose, the elk, the deer. I have dozens and dozens of animals going over them. They don't work. So the cameras were great in showing that they didn't work. But right now we're stalled at getting anything to happen, and it becomes this pitting of wills. This is a horrific picture. I hate putting these on. I was very upset when I took it. It was on Saturday night. She was killed right at the end of the fencing. So, we got a little bit of the solution solved, but we really need to get the animals using those bridges, which they are not. We do have some great success stories. US 6, we have a new bridge going in the first year, over 800 mule deer passes. I found out at long box culverts over 200 feet, they don't really work. Here's a whole bunch of mule deer coming off of I-15 just south of Cedar City. They looked in that box culvert, 270 feet long, and said no way. I-15, Wildcat South, this is one of the big culverts, over 4,000 mule deer passes a year. Very, very successful. And in Montana, US 93 South, we have this bridge here that was not made for wildlife, but we have over 800 deer passes in it in the first year. So you need to use your research to see how well things are working and actually advise your DOT on what to do. Okay.
So we're going to make a whirlwind tour through transportation planning really fast. One thing that you should really take home as a really important message is that we have major infrastructure problems that need to be fixed. They're aging. A lot of the bridges and so forth that we have gone over since all of us in here were kids are about to fall down into the rivers. This is an opportunity for us. So if you can take a little bit out of this planning process, then that would be great. Some of the planning tools are very, very complex, and I'm not going to really go over all these in any really amount that you can get a whole lot out of them, unfortunately. But basically, the surface transportation bill we're working on now, that is Safety Lou, has some really significant environmental measures in it that you should know about, particularly Section 6001 and Section 6002. And what 6001 says is this is a large-scale, long-term transportation planning rule. And it says we need to play well together. So the natural resource agencies are actually mandated to be asked by the transportation departments to give them some information about natural resources that we want as natural resource agencies for them to consider. One of the things that comes out of that process is what's called a state transportation improvement program, and that is something that's very important to know. I want to make a pitch for a document that I've come up with. It's called the steppe tracking tool. It's on the Wildlife Crossings Toolkit, which is a website that will be online here within a couple of weeks, I hope. Again, newly renovated, and that tool will help you to identify some of the typical threats and opportunities with different highway projects. If you Google on Wildlife Crossings Toolkit, you'll find it. You don't want to know the URL right now for sure. So 6002 is the project level planning. So first you do the big large scale, long-term stuff, and then comes the project level. It's actually quite different in process than the typical way that natural resource agencies do planning. And so that's another take-home message. We want to engage early and often in the transportation planning and project development, but part of the problem is that most natural resource agency specialists don't know what to do. I think I'll skip this here. We do have some social tools. One, I want to point out the last bullet there especially, and that is corridor or statewide habitat connectivity planning. And we can also do stewardship teams, which are little groups getting together doing specific things. But that coordination aspect doesn't have to be organized either. I mean, what's to say that you guys can't get together? And this is, I think, this is Patty's slide. This is a group of people who have gotten together and are actively solving problems, and they're sort of taking the bull by the horns and doing it themselves. Some of the other social tools are statewide habitat connectivity plans. Utah, I believe, has one, at least a beginning of one, sort of. Okay. So there's no mandate to do this, and so every state who has done it a little bit differently. The Western Governors Association Initiative on Wildlife Movement and Crucial Habitats was an attempt to try to wrap their arms around this process and make some standardization. We're still hoping that some good stuff will come out of that. But right now, it's you people getting together with the other agencies of interest. That is the DOTs, the natural resource agencies. All those together then can come up with a statewide habitat connectivity plan. And that, I think, is probably where we'll end. And I just want to go back to my original statement to say that unless animals are able to move freely across the landscape, then they're not going to be able to take full advantage of all the habitat that all of you in this room have worked so hard to make good for them.
Got time for questions for Sandy and Patty? Go ahead.
I suggested that you add in your presentation a section about wildlife being attracted to disturbed sites along highways due to inappropriate planting, such as in our state, Wyoming, crested wheatgrass and yellow sweet clover attract deer and pronghorns to the sides of roads that we hit. So it can work in reverse.
Yes,
and it also suggests that you emphasize native plant species along right-of-ways to consult wildlife or natural resource agencies to know what to plant along.
That's exactly right. The point was that animals can be attracted to their great detriment to the sides of roads by either salts, de-icing agents are really killers for not only with collisions, but they also actually, for some species, can kill them outright. But also, the planting can sometimes be very, very detrimental. We are actually doing some things in some states. The Forest Service has a botanist who is actually specializing in native plant revegetation alongside the roads. However, the problem is whether it's a native plant or an attractive nuisance, if animals are near the road, that's not a good situation. So, either way, it's a problem, I guess, native or not.
Has anybody looked at the effects of the cement central barriers on your mortality?
Yes. The question is, has anybody looked at the effect of median barriers, the so-called Jersey barriers? And the answer, yes. There has been some limited research done on that. It is definitely very, very difficult for most animals to get across. It's also an interesting administrative issue because most DOTs do not need to go through the environmental review process to put in median barriers. It's considered an administrative action. It saves lives dramatically, and so there's a real push to do it, not only from just a humane human aspect, but also because of the liability issue. But yes, median barriers definitely do cause connectivity issues.
What I definitely fight the DOT here, and we talk about that a lot, and there are two alternatives to them. If you drive I-15 or many other interstates, you see cable median barriers that act like rubber bands when a car hits them, pulls them back. And it's a lot nicer way to hit something if you're in that vehicle. And the other one is box beam barriers, which we have on I-70, which is just a 2-inch square box beam that goes along the median part of it. And so that one allows wildlife up and over. So please continue to push for those animal humane alternatives rather than the concrete.
And that's also, unfortunately, the DOTs don't usually like those other two options because they have greater risks to the maintenance people. When an accident does occur, they're harder to replace. So one of those concrete median barriers, they can pick it up with the truck and place it. So
I have a comment. I was traveling recently across Utah with a consulting landscape architect from here in Logan. He was pointing out, if they had cut back that fill slope and that cut slope further, it would look a lot better and blend into the aesthetics a lot better. So do you ever consider presenting to the Association of Landscape Architects or something?
Between Patty and I, we do a lot of talking. And yes, I mean, it's an interdisciplinary problem. We haven't actually, even the Forest Service, who's really good with interdisciplinary teamwork usually, hasn't even figured this out. This is like, this is a different kind of project. We don't need everybody at the table. Yeah, you do. It's just like everything else.
Is there enough data now to say, in certain given situations, an overpass is better than an underpass? And can you elaborate on it just a tad?
Depends on what species you're talking about. The question is an overpass better than an underpass? Yes and no. No and yes. It depends. But generally speaking, what you can do with an overpass is you can make it look and act like real habitat. So you can put soil on the top, you can plant it. You may not be able to get trees to grow, but you can make it look more like, even in Europe, they figured out how to put wetlands on the top for salamanders. So, Patty, you want to add to that?
Yeah, we're finding that the prey species prefer overpasses because they can see a lot better when they go through something long and dark or whatever. They're worried about the mountain lions ready to get them. So we find mountain lions and black bears will like culverts a little bit more, and we find them more in the culverts. But the overpasses, we definitely find more ungulates. Although we see some, like in the Montana situation, and of course the bear will use them as well. So we would love to push for overpasses, but they're normally 2 to 4 times more money than an underpass. So that's why we know how that makes. There's less than a dozen.
Yeah, and also if you look at what an animal's predator is, that gives you a big clue as to what kind of a structure it will like. For example, Pat was saying, those species that use enclosed areas for predator avoidance, they will accept culverts just fine, but the ones who need the visibility, not so much. Now you can make an underpass very wide and very open. The pictures that Patty showed, those that were very wide and open were definitely used. So the wider and more open you can make them, the better that they will be used for everything, essentially. And the closer they will approximate an overpass functionality.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Patty.